Hi everyone, this is Janda for Card Runners, and I'm here with Cutoff vs. Button vs. Blind Play Part 3, where we're going to look at 3-bet pots in position. The goals for this video are going to be to go over a quick review of theory and logic. Then we'll talk about 3-bet pots in position on all streets versus different types of actions. We of course can't go over every single possible action, but we'll discuss a variety of different concepts and topics regarding 3-bet pot play. So we're definitely not going to limit ourselves to just analyzing the flop. We're going to go into the turn in the river, and we'll try to note the close and key points in our range. So I'm also not going to list what I would do with every single hand in my range, because that will just take too long, but I want to point out the stuff that I think is really close or really key. Quick theory review. When we call a 3-bet, our range will be worse than the 3-betters. We called because we got a good price pre-flop, usually around 2-1, and have the advantage of position. At least in this example, we have the advantage of position, so we're assuming the 3-bet came from the small blind or the big blind. We called with many hands pre-flop expecting to overall lose money for the hand, just less than we would have if we immediately folded to the 3-bet. Because of this, we don't have to defend enough to prevent the 3-better from profitably betting any two cards on some board textures. So this is very similar to a spot where the button opens and the big blind calls, and in that spot, which happens all the time, you're probably very used to the big blind almost always checking, if not literally always checking, then the button betting at a pretty high frequency, and the big blind folding often enough that the button can profitably bet any two cards. That makes sense there because the button opens, gives the big blind a really, really cheap price, so the big blind calls with a weak range, which results in him check folding a lot. It's going to be a similar thing here, where even though we have the advantage of position here, if the small blind 3-bets and we call in the cutoff, for example, his range is going to be quite a lot better than ours. So because of that, there's nothing necessarily wrong if the small blind can profitably bet any two cards in some situations. There's already a lot of money in the pot, and we have the weaker range, so it makes sense that we might fold often enough that our opponent can profitably bet any two cards, but we're still going to defend reasonably aggressively. So now there's some other stuff we should mention because you're not a robot. So if our opponent bets 60% of the pot on the flop, we're getting slightly worse than 3-1 odds. So everyone pretty much knows that, I think, but 60% is a little bit over half the pot, so we're not getting quite 3-1 odds, but slightly worse. We are very, very regularly calling on the flop despite not being happy with our position because we're getting such a good price. Keep in mind, our really good hands got 4-bet pre-flop, so it's hard for us to be like really happy on the flop unless we flopped a monster, because the hands that we could have had that are like, you know, the really, really strong hands, they're not in our 3-bet calling range. Yeah, we slow play aces, but for the most part, like our ace king, our kings, our queens, that stuff all got 4-bet pre-flop, so our calling range just isn't that strong. We're not usually very happy with where we're at. Also keep in mind, our opponent's checking range is weaker than his betting range, so we usually dislike seeing a bet. So, in general, you know, sometimes you're going to have a really, really strong hand and want to face a bet. But for the most part, if your opponent's putting more money in the pot, that's not usually a good thing, because that means he thinks he has a profitable hand where he can put money in the pot. You'd much rather see him check and represent the weaker range. So, most people, myself included, find it hard getting yourself to do something that will likely have a bad outcome, but is overall a good life decision. So even if we're not thinking poker, an example would be I would hate having to spend 5 hours applying for a job that I think I have a 3% chance of getting. So yeah, just think of a non-poker example real quickly. Even if you know it's a really good decision to apply for a job you're unlikely to get, it sucks to have to spend 5 hours and basically waste a Saturday afternoon applying for a job when you know the outcome's going to likely be bad. So you might force yourself to do it because you know it's a really good life decision, but at the end of the day, it sucks to do something knowing you're probably going to get a bad outcome. Very few people want to do something where they know they're probably going to get a bad outcome. But that leak is absolutely devastating in poker. You have to take high variance but plus EV lines, so you have to make the right decision even though the outcome is probably going to be bad. And we're going to be doing that nonstop in this video. We're going to be calling with hands where, honestly, we're probably going to end up losing more money because we called. But since we are getting such a good price, and since the good outcome is disproportionately good compared to the bad outcome, because we are getting that good price, we're going to end up calling. So yeah, good outcome is better than the bad outcome in magnitude, so we call. All right, our thought process for flops, turns, rivers. So the first question I'm going to ask myself is, how good was this flop, turn, or river for our range relative to our opponent's range? And you're going to see me do the same thing that I did in the last video, which is just kind of guess how the equities change. The second question I'm going to ask myself is, what is the weakest hand that actually wants to face a bet? So again, I'm trying to make sure we get into that mental state where we understand we don't usually want to face bets, but that doesn't mean we're going to fold because calling will still be profitable. And then the last question I'm going to ask is, what is the weakest hand that will call or raise against a bet? So my goal here is really just to show, even if we don't have many hands in our range that want to face a bet, especially if our opponent's betting range is pretty polarized, we're not usually going to want to face a bet with many hands in our range. But that said, even though we don't have many hands that want to face a bet, we're usually going to be defending pretty aggressively. So we're usually going to be calling or raising with some hands that are still pretty weak, because calling or raising is more profitable than folding, even though we wish our opponent would have just checked. So now I have put the cutoff 3-bet calling range into Equilab. It's the range on the top. I did go ahead and include all the ace-10 off and king-jack off combos just to make it a little bit easier. But as I mentioned before, those might be a mixed strat where you fold them sometimes, 3-bet them, or sorry, you fold them sometimes, maybe call a 3-bet sometimes, and maybe you even 4-bet sometimes. And then I also put the small blind 3-betting range right here at the bottom, which we can look at really quickly again. And remember, the small blind 3-betting range is a pretty wide range. We're 3-betting the small blind 15% of the time. And as we can see, if the cutoff calling range includes all ace-10 off and king-jack off, it has 47% equity against the small blind's 53% equity. All right, so let's get down to business and start randomly generating them. The first one is boom, Queen 10, 8 two-tone. All right, so now pause for a moment and I want you to guess the equity. I'm going to guess the equity myself and maybe be very off here, but guess how much equity each range has on this Queen of clubs, 8 of clubs, 10 of diamonds flop. All right, so hopefully you've paused it already, and I'm going to think a little bit. So I think this board is going to favor the cutoff 3-bet calling range quite a bit, because the cutoff 3-bet calling range has all the like ace, queen off, queen, king off stuff. And then when there's two high cards, like the 10 also would favor the cutoff cold calling range, I think, pretty well, because it gives us ace 10 off. Although we don't have king 10 off. And we don't have jack 9 off. But I think overall this range is still going to do... overall, I think this flop's going to hit the cutoff cold calling range a little bit better than most flops do, because there are two high cards, and even the 8's not that low. It'll give us some pairs and some gutters and stuff. And yeah, we're also in position, so position's pretty nice, but that won't be reflected in the equity. So I'm going to guess that the cutoff cold calling range has like 48.7% equity. It's not like I'm that precise. I'm just gonna go all the way guessing. Oh, so even more than that. So 50.9%. Okay, so this board really favors the cutoff cold calling range. And by the way, whenever I say the cutoff cold calling range, I just mean the cutoff 3-bet calling range. I actually really dislike the term cold call, but I seem to be using it by accident because it's just easier to say. So just know whenever I say cold calling range, I mean the 3-bet calling range. All right, so here is the 3-bet calling range. And we already did the equity thing, so now the next thing I want to answer is, what is the worst hand I will defend here to a flop c-bet? So I'm going to make a guess before we look into this range in detail, and my guess off the top of my head would be something like ace 9 of diamonds. I think I would still defend, and that's probably the weakest hand I'd defend. So we're never going to know for sure if that's right, but that's what I would defend if I were actually playing ace 9 of diamonds or better. All right, so now let's actually get rid of this cumulative for a minute while we make that guess. Just looking at all our hands real quick. Yeah, I'm going to go with ace 9 or diamonds. I think I'm going to defend every single pair that's not pocket 7s, because 9s have the gutter, so I'm going to defend that. And then all the other pairs are pretty much going to most are going to be combo draws or be like top pair with a good kicker. So, yeah, ace 9 of diamonds, final answer, is the weakest hand I think I defend here. So now let's bring out this cumulative distribution. So cutoff has weak pair or better 76.6% of the time, or 87.5 combos. And the only pair we're folding, the only pair or better we're folding, I think, is pocket 7s. I can't see anything else I'd fold. So that means we are defending 81.5 combos out of 129.5 that are a pair or better. So let's put that in a calculator. 81.5 divided by 129.5. So that already means we're defending 63% of our range just from defending our pairs or better. Now let's look at what else we're defending. We're going to be defending our flush draws, but some of these are going to be pairs. So how do we... No, that doesn't do that. Okay, so we have to just manually count them. So that's going to be Ace-Jack, Ace-9, King-Jack, King-9, 7-6, and Ace-5. So that's going to be 6 combos that are flush draws that we defend. So that means we're defending 67.6% of our range is going to be the pairs or better or flush draws, because we've had 6 flush draws that aren't pairs, and then we had 6 pairs we're folding the pocket 7s. So that gets us the 67.6% that we can see in Flopzilla. And I'm trying to think if we defend anything else that's not a pair or a flush draw. Oh, gosh, we still have King-Jack and Ace-Jack. Wow. Yeah, we're defending a lot on this board. So that would mean we're going to be defending like another... Well, the Ace-Jack is going to make another 15 combos the King-Jack would make, depending on how many combos we're using, like maybe another 10. So if we defend those, that would be like 20, let's just say that's 20 more combos. So that'd be 107.5 divided 107.5 divided by 129.5. So that's 83% of our range here. Wow. Now, this doesn't mean the opponent won't have a betting range. This just means we're defending a very large fraction of our range. So maybe we're defending too wide, because I would also have defended like Ace-9 suited, as I mentioned. So maybe with Ace-9 suited, we'd be defending a little bit too wide. But it really should drive the point home for just how bad recklessly continuation betting is for the opponent on this Queen 10-8 board. I would have thought c-betting with a really bad hand would have been bad for the small blind, but now I just realized like the magnitude of how bad it likely is. Because I think all the hands we listed, most people would not fold. I can't imagine someone's going to really fold Ace-Jack on this flop. There's no way they fold King-Jack. So recklessly c-betting from the small blind shoes is going to be really bad. So the small blind should like go out of his way, you know, check reasonably often, and then defend some of his checks by check raising and check calling. Because we have a really strong range here. We're in position. We're going to bet reasonably often once our opponent checks. And when he does bet, we're going to defend really aggressively. So another thing to consider on this board is it really sucks for us to call on this flop and let our opponent see the turn relatively cheaply. So I'm going to do another guessing thing right now, because I like guessing when I'm analyzing stuff because it shows me how far off I am, so I learn from my mistakes quicker if I remember being wrong. So now I want to guess, like, okay, you should guess too. How often do you think Ace-Queen is beat on this flop if we have Ace-Queen? So and we're in the cutoff. So if we flop Ace, if we flop this flop and we have Ace-Queen, how often are we beat? And this is not something I've thought about much, but my guess is going to be we're beat like... Oh, I should mention splitting too. My guess is we're going to be like beat or splitting like 19% of the time, but I could be way off there. But let's look. How often does small blind have Ace-Queen beating or split? So let's say we have Ace-Queen, top pair. So we want to add, we're going to look at his over pair or better, and we're going to add how many combos of Ace-Queen can our opponent have if we have Ace-Queen and there's a queen on the board. So you should know this. The answer is 6. There's 3. If we have Ace-Queen and this is the flop, there's 3 aces left in the deck and 2 queens left in the deck. So 3 times 2 is going to be 6. There's 6 combos of Ace-Queen in the opponent's range. So if there's 6 Ace-Queen in the opponent's range, we're going to add these 6 combos to the 21 that are over pair or better. So it's going to be 27 divided by 138. 27 divided by 138. So we're beat 19.5% of the time. Okay. So you're not going to get a clear answer here. But if an opponent's recklessly c-betting here, like raising Ace-Queen might actually be good, because even though we don't really want action when we raise Ace-Queen, we really don't want to give a lot of free cards here. But if the opponent's not recklessly c-betting, and he's c-betting a more polarized range, and maybe he's check calling with like a lot of the hands Ace-Queen does really well against, like maybe he check calls on the flop with Queen-Jack and King-Queen, like I think he should. If that's the case, then raising Ace-Queen is probably not going to be as effective. So I don't think we're going to want to raise Ace-Queen in the cutoff, though it's something I would at least consider now after having looked at this board, meaning if I was in the cutoff in the small blind c-bet, and I have a HUD, I would pull up his stats. And if he c-bets recklessly and 3-bets from the small blind really aggressively, I would pretty much consider a raise, because our ace-queen's strong, but it's also really vulnerable. Okay, so anyways, let's go back to the cutoff calling range. Where are you? Right here. So the hands I'm going to raise here are probably just going to be anything really that strong. I don't think I'm going to slow play on this board. So something that I talk about pretty often with people that I discuss poker with is I think optimal poker has a very come at me bro attitude in a lot of spots. So like right here, for example, on this flop, I don't think I'd slow play anything strong. But by the same token, our range isn't really going to be capped all that often on the turn. And even if our range is capped at like ace-queen on a 3 of spades turn, which is what it would be capped at, like in, I don't think we would have anything better than ace-queen, but maybe I'm missing one hand. But if our range is capped at, let's say, ace-queen on a 3 turn, ace-queen's still pretty good. Like, I mean, I'm not happy about my overall range on the 3 of spades turn after I called my opponent's flop bet, but we got a really good price. We didn't know the turn was going to be a total blank. We probably called with a lot of hands that could improve. That didn't. And ace-queen's still pretty good. So, yeah, I would call on the flop, I think, with ace-queen and weaker hands, whereas I would raise the hands that are better than ace-queen and then some bluffs. So let's get into that right now. All right, so what's better than ace-queen? Let's overpair better. All these hands. Yeah, I'm going to raise pretty much all those. I don't think I slow play any of them. I think they're all too vulnerable. If you want to slow play aces with a club, more power to you. I don't really care. But I think I would go ahead and raise all of the highlighted hands, which is 20 combos. And then to balance that, I always forget this, but off the top of my head, I think we definitely need a lot less bluffs since it's a 3-bet pot. But I think it's something like 60% value to 40% bluff, although the term value bet and bluff don't work perfectly anyways. So if we're raising like 20 combos for value here, I'd probably look to raise like, I don't know, maybe 13 or 14, maybe like 12 or 13 bluffs and a couple draws, something like that. Seems fair enough. And it's, of course, going to depend on sizing and everything too. But I do believe I'm remembering it correctly, and it's somewhere around there. So yeah, let's say we raise these, and let's say we want to raise, like 13 bluffs. So let's try to find those 13 bluffs. Or 12 bluffs, or something like that. All right, so I think like the ace-9 of diamonds, I think that's something that can raise pretty well. And then another thing too, and I actually have to kind of give credit to Poker Snowy for this. Poker Snowy likes to sort of, if you want to call it a bluff raise, it would probably be reasonable, but Poker Snowy likes to bluff raise with some kind of high equity hands. So for example, I wouldn't be surprised if Poker Snowy wants to raise like 9-8 suited here. Like, and when I say 9-8 suited, it can be the 9-8 of diamonds or the spades or the hearts. So 8-9 suited might be a profitable call, but it might also be kind of nice to raise that hand because we can check back on a 9 turn, because now we have, the weakest 2 pair, but they might be good. Our opponent could easily have aces, kings, or ace-queen, and we're ahead. So we can check back if we turn a 9. We can keep value betting, or we can start value betting if we turn an 8 or a jack, I guess, is a little bit thinner, but I think we can still go ahead and keep value betting if we turn a jack. Our opponent might have some ace-kings, but whatever. So yeah, we can value bet if we turn a jack or an 8. We can check back if we turn a 9. And even though 8-9 suited might be a profitable flop call, it has a reasonable amount of equity on the flop. So if we, when a hand has a reasonable amount of equity and its equity is pretty robust, it might be worthwhile putting it in the raising range because we want to take some sort of high equity hands with, some hands that have a good amount of equity and the equity is robust and put them in the range where more money goes into the pot. So let me try to be a little bit clearer about that because I don't think I explained it particularly well. The older way of thinking, I think, is to kind of raise your best hands for value, call your next best hands, bluff your hands not strong enough to call, and then fold your worst hands. And we've already seen that doesn't work very well pre-flop. Like, I used to design ranges like that 4 years ago, and ranges now are just much, much better. Post-flop in a spot like that, we're gonna play closer to that. We're gonna play closer to raising our best hands, calling our next best, bluffing our next best, folding our worst. But sometimes it might be good to take a hand that would still make a pretty good call and move it to the raising range, even though you'd probably consider it a bluff raise. We're going to try to either, get lucky and outdraw our opponent or make them fold a better hand. And I just think a hand like, 9-8, because it does have a reasonable amount of robust equity and might play reasonably well as a raise. Whereas a hand like ace-jack, ace-jack might be a little bit better to call with because, if we call with ace-jack, maybe our opponent's barreling on the flop with king-jack. And then if we have ace-jack and our opponent has king-jack, we're going to be doing very, very well. His jack is tainted. If he makes the king, we make the straight. And then if, the turn card comes in 9, it's going to be pretty obvious. Ace jack's not very good once the turn comes in 9. And if the turn card comes in ace, we'll probably lose some value, but not a tremendous amount. And we might still float. So I want to be clear. We might still call on a 9 turn because we'll have 4 to the straight and we'll be drawing to the nuts if the river kings. But we likely are just going to fold, I think, if the turn card comes in 9 and our opponent barrels. And if he does barrel, we're not usually going to end up losing a huge pot with ace high. Okay, so what other hands make good bluff raises? I think king 9 suited would be one. And then I'm already starting to struggle a little bit. Okay, so I'm already struggling. So I think there are a lot of hands that make good value raises here. I mean, those were easy to find, right? It was just pretty much this stuff. But I'm having a hard time finding hands that make good bluff raises. And we can definitely raise some draws. But if I'm noticing this as I'm analyzing ranges, I'm immediately going to take a mental note and be like, okay, notice on this board, a lot of hands make good value raises, but very few hands make good bluff raises. From my experience talking with just various players, especially if they're like smaller stakes players, there's still a tendency to do the whole raise your best hands for value, call your next best, bluff your next best, fold your worst. There's that tendency that is still there because that's, I think, how people used to play a little bit more like a couple years ago. And also because that strategy just works kind of well. Like in a lot of spots, like if the cutoff opens and we're on the button pre-flop, raising our best hands for value, calling our next best, and 3-bet bluffing the hands not quite good enough to call actually works really well. So there are a lot of spots where, doing that whole, I'm going to say it one more time, sorry, raise your best, call your next best, bluff raise your next best, fold your worst, that strategy still works pretty well. But because that strategy works pretty well, and because I think more people used to apply that strategy a couple years ago, I think you see people still over-applying that now. Whereas it's harder to get yourself to like bluff raise with a hand that would still make a pretty good call. So now on this flop, I've noticed I would not be bluff raising enough here if I was playing. Like I'm not going to have this range in front of me if I'm playing. I'm just going to straight up make a mistake. So I probably should think here like, okay, my range is crazy strong here in the cutoff after I call a 3-bet. The small blind really shouldn't be c-betting that recklessly if he's good. So maybe a hand like ace-jack that I thought was a call, maybe I should be bluff raising that. Like maybe ace-jack off with, let's say, the ace of clubs, maybe that makes a good bluff raise because if I raise and my opponent calls, I can ship the turn really comfortably. If I raise and I get my opponent to fold, I probably made him fold the better hand. And I almost certainly made him fold the better hand, really. And if I raise and my opponent 3-bets all in, it's not really devastating to have to fold that hand. So yeah, we can do a mixture of raising like some of our draws and calling some of our draws. And by draws, I mean like an open-ended straight draw or a flush draw, a draw with 8 or more outs. But I think with a hand like ace-jack, I probably would have called with them all here. But seeing how aggressively I want to be raising for value, I probably should, be raising my ace-jack off. Even with or without a club, I probably should be raising some. And so yeah, let's say I raise ace-jack off with the ace of clubs, ace-jack with a diamond, ace-jack, and then maybe a couple of the ace-jack with no ace of clubs I raise, whereas others I call. I should be maybe playing more of a mixed strategy there, so I am not just super weighted towards value raises when I raise. And then for all the other hands I'd mentioned I'd defend with, I probably still would defend with them, and I would just realize when we call with a lot of these hands, they're only probably very slightly profitable calls, but we're calling because we're getting a good price and our hand has a reasonable amount of equity. The weakest hand I think I called with was like ace-jack off, because I raised the ace-9 of diamonds. So ace-jack off is probably the weakest hand we called with. We're drawing to the nuts. We're drawing, an ace is going to be good a lot of the time too. So, yeah, I think that's how I would defend this range here in position. The other thing I would just make sure I really took from this is, honestly, if I had to guess what these ranges we're using, the small blind's c-bet frequency on this board should probably be low. So let's go back and look at that range again. I mean, it's fine for the small blind to 3-bet here some of the time. If he literally always checks, I think his checking range would get too strong and we could exploit that in position. But I think the small blind should not have a very high c-betting frequency. So if somehow I magically knew that in theory the small blind should only be c-betting on this flop like 25% of the time or 20% of the time, that would not surprise me. Because this is a board that the player in position has more equity. This range has 16.1% over pair or better. The cutoff call has 16.7% over. Well, that's the wrong range. Has 15.4% over pair or better. So very similar there. So yeah, they have a similar amount of equity, a similar amount of really, really good hands, and then the button just has position, and position is really, really good here. Okay, so that was a lot of talking. Now let's quickly discuss what we do here in position if our opponent checked on the flop. And I don't think this is a spot most people will struggle with. I think most people are pretty comfortable with playing against checks. You just kind of bet the good stuff, bet some bluffs, and then check back the middle stuff. So, yeah, I would do that, and I would start my value betting range at probably like king, queen, or better. Even king, queen might be a check on the flop, but honestly, I'd probably just bet it. I think people don't check raise as aggressively as they maybe should on this board in general from what I've seen and what I can remember. Again, I'm not actively playing, so maybe the games have changed, but I think you can still comfortably bet it like with king, queen here if you're playing small stakes or lower. I would definitely bet like all the really good stuff. You don't have anything here that's really strong enough to slow play, I don't think. And slow playing on a board like this isn't really that good unless you think you're going to face overbets. And again, that's something that I just haven't heard of people doing much. So let's say we have Jack 9 of clubs on this flop for like the super nuts. I still wouldn't slow play it because I do talk a good amount of poker and people just aren't showing me hands where they check back on a flop like this and then they face an overbet on the turn in river. So if people were doing that, then yeah, we maybe should check back Jack 9 of clubs. But since most people probably aren't, most people you're playing against if you're watching this video probably aren't, I would definitely not slow play that. So yeah, bet the good stuff, check the middle stuff. And then for the bluffs, I want to just point out I would not bluff a hand like 7-6 of spades here. I think that's like one of the weakest hands we can have in our range. Or actually, let's get crazy with it. Like ace-5 of spades is probably like the weakest hand we can have. I would not bluff with this hand. I don't think it has enough equity. Its equity is not robust enough. So when I say I wouldn't bluff with ace-5 of spades, I mean I wouldn't bluff with it on the flop. I would rather bluff with the hands that have a little bit more equity and a little bit more robust equity. Whereas a hand that's like as crappy as ace-5 of spades or 7-6 of spades, I would just say, hey, let's check this back, and then if we want, we can bluff it later. But let's put the better bluffs in our flop betting range because we're building the pot when we bluff on the flop. So let's put our good bluffs in that range. Some of the hands like, can get lucky. Whereas if our opponents, if our opponents check and we check back, we're still going to need probably, like, let's say the turn's a 4. We're still going to need some hands that can bluff here if our opponent checks us on the turn. So then when we're value betting our, like, queen, jack, maybe king, queen if we have it, maybe we'll even start value betting some pocket jacks if we have them, although I know they're not in this range right now. But if we had pocket jacks, we might start betting them on the turn. Then we can bluff with, like, the ace-5 of spades. Or if we had the ace-5 of spades on the 4 of heart turn, we could even save the bluff to the river. We could even check back twice with the ace-5 of spades, not because we plan on showing down with it, but because we want some hands to bluff with on the river, and maybe we want to bluff the really crappy hand on the river. So that's a whole other long discussion, but I just really want to point out, I think neither the out-of-position or in-position player should be bluffing on the flop with the really crappy hands. All right, so let's randomly generate the turn. We've been talking about the flop a lot. So we'll talk about the turn based on a few different lines that could have happened on the flop, so let's randomly generate it. And let's talk about what we would do if our opponent bet the flop and we called first, because I think that's going to happen a lot more often in practice than it should in theory. Okay, so if we call a flop bet, I'm just going to unclick this for 1 sec. If we call a flop bet, we definitely know our range is going to be pretty much capped on the turn, and our opponent should have a sense of that too, because we wouldn't really slow play a strong hand on a board this way. So we're kind of taking that come at me bro attitude where, yeah, the turn's going to often improve a lot of hands in our range, but even if it doesn't, we're still going to have some ace queens and stuff, and we're just going to end up having to be unhappy and calling sometimes. On this turn card, some flushes got there. So it's probably not going to be particularly tough to play this turn card. I don't think I talked about what I would do with 8-7 on the flop, but that might be a call, that might be a raise, that could even be a fold. So maybe we'll have some 8-7 in our range. It's not an awesome hand, so that's going to be called with anyways. Sorry, if we have it on the turn, it's going to be called with anyways. I'm trying to think if anything else kind of got there, other than the flushes. And the flushes is a huge deal. But yeah, Jack 9 was already straight, so it didn't. Okay, cool. So mainly just some flushes got there. Okay, so if we face a turn bet here, sort of, like, I would kind of imagine the situation like this a little bit. When the button opens, and people like to min-raise on the button, even though I particularly don't, if the button min-raises and you call in the big blind, ranges are very asymmetrical on the flop, and you're going to be check folding a lot because you're out of position and your opponent's range is a lot better than yours. I would take a kind of similar attitude to once you've called a c-bet on this flop. Now, that doesn't mean I think you're going to fold like crazy on the turn, but I mean, I would at least have the attitude which was like, you know what, I called a lot of hands on the flop because I was getting a really good price, so my opponent's range is going to be better than me on the turn. So it might not be a problem if I let my opponent c-bet any 2 cards profitably on the turn, because he wasn't able to do that on the flop. I defended like crazy on the flop, so even if my opponent can get in a profitable turn spot, you know, even if his turn bet is profitable, he had to pay money to get into that situation. And if we raise him reasonably aggressively on the flop, then he doesn't even always get to the option of bluffing the turn. Because a lot of times he would have been, you know, c-bet bluffing on the flop. We raise him on the flop, and he just has to muck. All right, so yeah, our range is going to be weaker than our opponents on the turn. We get this turn card, though, and some of our hands get there. So what's the weakest hand I would defend with here? I mean, it's going to be probably some sort of draw. So let's think. I'm trying to think the weakest draw I can have. So the weakest draw I can have is probably going to be like King Jack with a club, or no, that's not the weakest draw we can have. Let me think. It's going to be like King Jack without a club. So King Jack without a club, I think, folds here on the turn. I'm not going to count out all the combos, but remember, our flop continuing range was really, really wide. We were defending like over 80% of the time, though not always by calling. And King Jack wasn't like a phenomenal hand. And then on the turn, you know, this turn card kind of sucks for King Jack. So King Jack without a club, I think I'm going to say I'm definitely folding right now, though of course I could be wrong. And then Ace Jack also without a club, which we may or may not have any. I'm mucking all of those. So Ace Jack and King Jack without a club, I think get mucked reasonably quickly. Then what else? We were also calling on the flop with hands like 10 Jack, Ace 10, and then King 10 suited. So I probably too would fold most of those that don't have a club. And then I would mostly defend with, like, let's think. Nines with a club I would defend. I think nines without a club I would not. Jack 10, I'm folding. 10-9, I think I'm calling. Though that might be bad, but I think I would. And then, what else? I'm trying to just think. Sorry, I know it sucks when I'm just like saying in the mic as I'm thinking, but unfortunately I gotta do it. Yeah, so muck the King Jacks, mucks the Ace Jacks, muck some of like, I think the Jack 10 gets mucked, the King 10 gets mucked, and the Ace 10 even gets mucked. And again, if I'm folding like enough that my opponent can profitably c-bet any 2 cards on this turn, I'm not having a big problem with it. And then on the turn, I think a lot of our flushes are going to be like the nut flush. And so we could raise some of those, and we can maybe ship some like semi-bluffs too. So if we did call on the flop with, you know, the King Jacks and the Ace Jacks, maybe we call with some of them on the turn, and we ship some on the turn. All right, so yeah, mostly muck the middle pair stuff. And then the draws that didn't improve. If our opponent bet on the flop and checked to us on this 7 club turn, I'm actually probably, I don't think I'm going to bet crazy aggressively on that turn. I think we're definitely going to obviously bet our flushes. And then I think you're going to want to bet your ace queens with or without the clubs because they're strong and vulnerable. And I think you, in practice, I think I would check the king queens, and I think I would bet the ace queens. I also think on this turn, you're probably not going to get check raised in practice all that often because people in general, I don't think like to check raise as aggressively when they can check raise like right into the nuts. So here, yeah, I mean, I shouldn't say that for sure. I don't know, and it's going to depend on what limit you're playing. But I would bet ace queen, and I would not expect to get check raised all that often. I think what's going to be more common is someone c-bets on the flop with a hand they shouldn't c-bet with, and then when you call, they end up holding like king queen on the turn, and then they go and then they check call it. So I would definitely bet ace queen if my opponent checks to me. But again, your mileage may vary based on what limit you play. So yeah, ace queen better, I'm betting on the turn. Pretty much everything in the middle I'm checking. And then for the bluffs, you're just going to have your like king jack and ace jack that bluff. You also probably have some nines. You might have a couple nine stuff. Like 8-9, I would just go ahead and bluff with it if we didn't raise it on the flop. 10-9-2, I would probably turn it into a bluff just because I think it has enough equity that I'd rather put it in the betting range as a semi-bluff than I would rather check back with it. So yeah, I think it's pretty easy, again, just to play against checks. So another interesting line that could happen is your opponent checks flop, you check flop back, and then he bets. What's cool here to notice is that line's actually pretty easy to defend against unless your opponent starts overbetting. And it might actually make sense for him to overbet here, because if you're going to c-bet all of your flush draws on the flop, whereas if your opponent was c-betting at a very low frequency, that means your opponent can have flushes on the turn, but you can't. And likewise, your opponent might have been trying to check raise on the flop with like jack 9, pocket 10s, pocket 8s, whatever. So he could have pocket tens or pocket eights in his range on the turn if it went check, check on the flop, but you can't because you would not have checked back in position with any of the nutted hands. So this is a spot where, especially exploitatively, but I think even in theory, an overbet can make a lot of sense. And it's something you want to consider doing if you're the out of position player. So let's get rid of the turn card for a second and imagine you were in the small blind. If you were, checking a lot on this flop texture as I talked about, and then the turn card came to 7 of clubs, I think you can definitely look at your opponent's stats and see if you think he makes a really good overbet bluff target. Because he might just have stats where he'll just fold way, way too much. And I would challenge you, as you're watching this video, to imagine you checked back this flop and this card came to turn. How often would you really defend if your opponent overbet? I mean, you're probably going to defend with your hands that are like, some sort of ace or king flush draw with either then a draw or a pair, which there might not be even that many of those. So like you're going to defend with like king queen off with the king of clubs, but you're not going to have that many combos of that. Ace jack you probably actually bet on the flop anyways, so I shouldn't even say that. So I think on this flop, on this turn, if my opponent overbet and I was in the cutoff, I would just fold like crazy, and I would expect most players to fold like crazy too. And again, when I say most players, I'm assuming most people watching this are playing like small stakes. I would expect you to just get a ton of folds from the small blind shoes if you overbet this turn, because it's just really hard for the cutoff to be strong after he checked back. And that doesn't mean the cutoff did anything wrong. It just means the cutoff checked back with a range that just does kind of poorly on club turns, and then the 1 in 5 shot hit where he got a club turn. All right, so if the small blind bets small in the turn, though, it's pretty easy. You just call with all the medium strength stuff. You're pretty much going to have no raising range, and then just fold all the weaker stuff. Okay, so we're done with the turn. I'm going to randomly generate the river now. Why did that not work? Okay, we got to re-random it. Sorry, I didn't lock the turn. All right, now everything's secure. Time to randomly generate it. All right, the 6. Okay, river 6. So if I'm playing and I'm in the cutoff shoes and I'm facing a bunch of barrels on this board, I'm pretty much going to be lost. Like realistically, I'm not going to know my range enough. Would have been playing multiple tables. I'm going to be confused what the small blind's betting with on the flop, what he's betting with on the turn, and then if he just barrels away and the river card comes to 9, I'm just going to be like, okay, I'm pretty much lost here, and then I'm going to just kind of freeze up and call with the better hands in my range. But that's probably reasonably close to what's theoretically correct too, right? You just call with the better hands. So here on the river, we just are kind of guessing our range on the river. That was a bad sentence. But we're kind of guessing what our range looks like and calling with just like the hands that seem good enough. So I think on the river, I would probably find the hero call against someone good with like ace queens, fold the queen kings, and then if I can have any 9s, I would obviously call with those. I guess I said I could have 9s with the club, so yeah, snap that off. If I slow played any flushes, call with that. But on the river, my calling range is basically going to be ace queen or better. A question I don't know the answer to right here is whether or not calling with the ace of clubs helps us. So for example, like let's say we have ace queen with the ace of clubs. I think most people would think, oh, call with the ace queen with the ace of clubs because you block the nut flushes in the opponent's range. And that's true, but we also block our opponent if he was like gonna bluff all 3 streets with like ace jack off with the ace of clubs. So we're not just blocking the nut flushes, we're blocking the nut flush semi-bluff, which might keep bluffing on the river. That makes it tricky. Like, I don't know the answer to that, whether or not having the ace of clubs blocker is good. And that's just a question that I expect people that are like a lot better than me to know. But it's not something that's detailed enough for me to like care a tremendous amount about. But if you are that good, then that actually could maybe matter a lot. Because I wouldn't be surprised if whether or not you have the ace of club blocker makes calling, significantly better, significantly worse. I just don't know it off the top of my head. So yeah, on this river, I think in reality, you're going to always look at stats if you have a HUD. And I think if it was a completely HUD-less site, I would probably just fold too much on the river. But my guess is what's like theoretically correct. It's just going to be to call with your better stuff. And that's probably going to mean you're going to call like ace queen and better. And I think you're going to fold like king queen. I think you're going to fold, like any of the draws that just have whiffed. And I think you're going to even fold like, yeah, I think king queen will be the best hand you fold. And even then, in theory, it wouldn't blow my mind if like that needs to be called, because if we're folding enough, like let me think what we'd be folding. We'd be folding some ace jack and some king jack, the ones that had the clubs, and we'd be folding Oh, not, I guess not all that much. Yeah. So I would just, if I had to guess right now, calling in theory is maybe like ace queen and better, but really just a guess. So yeah, we could write out all the combos here, but again, this isn't something I want to do for this specific video. I want it to be more like, what would we do if we're playing? Likewise, if we want to think about what we do from the small blind's perspective, I think this is a reasonable river card to bluff on because I don't think people are going to slow play all that often on the turn or the flop. So that means it's kind of hard for the cutoff to be nutted. And I think our opponent's going to have a lot of queen, king, and ace, queen on the river. So it really just becomes one of those, do you think the opponent will muck ace, queen, and queen, king when they face a river shove? And I think the answer to that, again, for most small stakes players would be yes. I think most people will find the fold with ace, queen, or queen, king. But yeah, you're really gonna want to use a HUD here. But I think it's a pretty good spot to bluff if you're this if you're in the small blind, and it might even be profitable to bluff any two cards profitably, to be honest. And we've talked about how that can make sense once ranges are asymmetrical. So yeah, you can definitely tell just from me talking. I'll go ahead and own it. My river advice is probably the worst here because I'm just not super comfortable in this spot. But I do think it's a good spot for the small blind to bluff. I think it might be theoretically correct if the small blind can profitably bluff any two cards, because he might just not have that many pure air hands on the river to begin with. And then I think if we are in the cutoff, our range is going to still be weaker than our opponents on the river, I think. And it's okay if we fold enough that he can profitably bet any two cards, I think. But again, this is mostly guessing. If I wanted to have a stronger opinion, I have to write out all the combos, and we're not doing that in this vid. And another cool thing to just keep in mind is, like, if you checked the flop in the turn with ace five of spades and it's been checking down, now would be kind of like when I bluff with it, where it's just like it's not even really ace high. It's like ace high with if the opponent has no kicker. So you can check back multiple streets with, I think, a hand that has almost no equity, and then on the river, if it just keeps checking down, now you go, okay, now I want to bet ace five suited to balance out my bluffs with whatever you're value betting with on the river. Maybe it's pocket sevens, maybe it's pocket nines, whatever. But I do want to stress, and it might be the most important thing you take from this video if you don't know it, going all the way back to the flop. When I say I would check back ace five of spades, its EV is not 0, and I'm not saying don't bluff it or just, give up, you're done. The board hits too many hands. I'm saying we're going to start with checking, and then if, it keeps getting checked, we're going to give it a little bluffarooski. We're not giving up with it yet. We just don't think the flop is the best spot to bluff, or at least I don't. I would delay the bluff till later. So that board took a little bit longer than I thought. We've only done one hand, so I'll stick with the small blind 3-betting range and try to go a little bit faster, but let's randomly generate one more. All right, so 998. So ask yourself how the equity is going to change. See if you can guess correctly. This one, I don't want to cheat. I don't want to look at the range. But this one I'm going to guess is going to be, let's get that range out of there. This one I'm going to guess is going to favor the small blind 3-betting range, because I think the small blind still 3-bet a reasonable amount of trips here, right? The small blind is still 3-betting like 10-9, Jack-9, Queen-9, King-9. Whereas if we would have made the board like 8-8-7, it would miss the 3-betting range a little bit more. Whereas the cold calling range, I did it again, cold call. The 3-bet calling range, I don't think has that many. It doesn't have like offsuit 9s, right? Like it has offsuit 10s and ace 10 off. And it has tons of offsuit jacks, queens, and kings. But no offsuit 9s, I don't think. So because of that, I don't think it's going to have that many combos of trips. I think the small blind will probably have a little bit more trips than the cutoff. And then the small blind has all the overpairs and like a lot of really good semi-bluffing hands like ace king and just jack 10. So I think this is going to favor the 3-betting range a little bit. So I'm going to guess that the 3-betting range has maybe 54% equity, or this probably not even that much, like 53.5. Oh, all right, so almost no change in equity, just 52%. So let's check out how many trips each range has. So this range has 3 of a kind, 11%. Or sorry, I just want the trips. That's 7.5%, whereas the small blind 3-bet has it. Oh, less than that. Okay, so the caller actually has more trips than the 3-better. That surprises me, but it is what it is. Let's see that. So that's ace 9, king 9, queen 9, jack 9, 10 9. So it's okay, and then okay, so that makes sense. I guess the cutoff, was getting a good price with the suited 9s, so it called reasonably wide with them. It has all the suited 9s that are better than 9-8 suited, whereas the 3-betting range has around a similar amount, but it doesn't have. Wait, why is that? So what am I doing wrong here? There's 18 combos of trips in the 3-betting range. and there's 18 combos of trips in the 3-bet call. Oh, because the cutoff 3-bet calling range is reasonably tight. They both have the same trip hands, but the cutoff 3-bet calling range is actually tighter than the small blind 3-betting range. That wouldn't be the case in the other positions, right? When we're using a more polarized 3-betting range from the button or from the big blind against the cutoff open, then those ranges are overall tighter, right? We're only 3-betting 9% of the time in the big blind and 10% of the time in the button. But since the small blind is not using a polarized 3-betting range, it's 3-betting wider. So if both the small blind 3-betting range and the cutoff calling range have the same trip hands, because the small blind 3-betting range is wider, it has less trip combos, or a smaller percentage of trips, sorry. Hopefully that was clear. But in case it wasn't, I was saying both ranges have the same combos of trips, which is 10-9 suited and better. But since the small blind 3-betting range is actually like wider than the cutoff 3-bet calling range, because the small blind 3-betting range is not polarized, it's, you know, it can 3-bet aggressively because it has only good hands. Because of that, the small blind 3-betting range is wider, and it has a lower percentage of its range be trips. Okay, so let's talk flop stuff. Here, I think the small blind is going to go ahead and c-bet, you know, reasonably aggressively, but it's not going to get crazy with anything. One of the things that's difficult to do on a board like this is there aren't really that many obvious check calling hands. And what further makes this board tricky is it's kind of hard to check raise as the 3-better, because you don't really have like any hands that make really good check raises. Like the hands that might make good check raises are going to be like, you know, trips, but we block trips in our opponent's range if we have the trips. So if we check with like Queen 9 and our opponent bets, he's likely bluffing, and then check raising is not going to be as effective as maybe check calling would be. So because of that, I don't think this is going to be a board that's kind of hard to play out of position, but I think I would play this board by c-betting pretty aggressively, and then you could design some sort of flop check calling range that would include like some random 8s, like ace-8 and 8-7 I think are going to be okay to check call. I think you could check call like a couple of overpairs, but they're okay to bet too. And likewise, hands like ace-queen I think are going to be fine to check call as well. Ace-queen has a good amount of equity even when it's behind, and I think ace-queen is going to be the better hand reasonably often. So let's look here. Let's look at the cutoff flat versus 3-bet. So yeah, wow. So the cutoff only has a pair or better 31% of the time, and ace-queen is going to beat or split with every non-pair hand. You know, on the flop, on the flop, ace-queen will be ahead of or be splitting with every non-pair hand. So yeah, checking ace-queen actually looks pretty good from the small blind 3-betting range right here. So that's something that I would do. Ace-king's okay to check a call too. And to be honest, a lot of these hands probably have mixed strategies, but I think that I'd be more likely to bet ace-king than I would be to bet ace-queen, because with ace-king, I can justify my bet as like, hey, I'm going to bet with ace-king, but I might, you know, I can bet with ace-king and maybe check call it on the turn, or, you know, reevaluate the turn and see if I want to keep betting or check fold. But if I bet ace-king on the flop, I can get value from the cutoff's ace-queens. Whereas with ace-queen, I can't really get value if I bet ace-queen. Maybe I can get some ace-jack to call, but probably not a whole lot. So if I was going to pick, you know, one hand to check call with on this flop, my gut would be the best ones like ace-queen. Maybe ace-king is still a check too, but ace-king I think you can also bet. You can maybe split it, bet some, check some. Okay, so yeah, so the out of position range here, I think you're going to want to just slow play some hands by check calling some of the good stuff. You're going to want to check call with some of the ace-queen stuff and some of the 8x stuff. You might still want to have some check raising range here, to be honest, but because of the like tricky removal effect, I think I would emphasize check calling the good hands a little bit more. Okay, yeah, so I think that pretty much covers it. And as I said, I think the small blind can c-bet here reasonably aggressively. Nothing crazy, but a lot more aggressively than the last board. All right, when the cutoff's facing a bet, I think here you're going to have, if I was in the cutoff, I would have I would very rarely raise on this flop. I can't think of anything I'd really want to raise that badly, to be honest. You can maybe raise a couple, like ace-9 and king-9 and some bluffs, but that's about it. Again, mostly on a board like this, when the hands that are good enough to raise are trips, and they're strong enough to slow play, and they block the opponent's good hands, I'm more likely to just call on the flop. So the same way I didn't like really check raising as a small blind, I don't like really raising on this flop all that much. There still is probably some check raising range and some flop raising range, but I just don't think it should be occur at that high of a frequency. The weakest hand I want to check call with here, I should have done that first. It's probably going to be just some random gutter. I don't think I would call with anything that's not a gutter. Sevens seem really close to me. I feel like I would rather defend on this flop with like Queen 10 than pocket sevens, but that doesn't mean they're not both calls. So I think sevens are going to be really close. I would defend any gutter or better. Let's see how many hands that is. So we have a weak pair of betters, 31.3%. Then we have gut shots and open-ended straight draws is another 12%. And we're going to defend on this flop with like ace queen, as I already mentioned. Okay, I think I would defend sevens because I think I would rather defend sevens on the flop and fold like king jack and king queen. And so we'll fold king jack on the flop, king queen on the flop. What else? Ace 10 is going to get folded on the flop for sure. So that seems like it's enough folds, and pairs of sevens seem good enough that they actually are a flop call, and I might have just been way off thinking it can maybe be folded. Let's see how often the... So yeah, in general, I try to stay away from calling with hands where if we're beat, we're very unlikely to outdraw our opponent, and if we're behind, our opponent has a good amount of odds. That said, I still think you can defend sevens here now that I'm looking at the range more, because sevens are only beat on the flop 33% of the time, and weird as it is, I guess less than that since sevens, no, let's just say 33%. And even the sevens can just sometimes bink the boat or hit a runner straight, right? We do have 3 to a straight with the sevens. And I love 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight hands. So, we're halfway there. We got 3 to a straight. So, yeah, I think sevens are a call. So, sevens are a call, and then I would call with ace queen. I would call, just to be clear, I think most people probably already knew this, but when I say like I would fold like king queen, ace jack, I'm not talking about the 3 to the flush. So, I would pretty much defend all of those. And then, yeah, defend the 8s and that kind of stuff too. So, let's lock this flop and randomly generate the turn. All right, so the jack of diamonds. So remember on the last board texture, the queen 10 8 board on the flop, how I said how if you call in the cutoff after the small blind c bets the flop, you're going to a lot of times have to be like, just have a come at me bro attitude, or if the turn card is like a blank, you're going to have a capped range and you still have to call sometimes even though you're not happy. That's not really going to be the case here. Here, when we called on the flop, we were pretty much slow playing all of our really strong hands, so I don't expect our range to be that much weaker than our opponents once we called. Because the thing that makes our the thing that makes our range weaker on the turn will be like if we don't have any really good hands because we raised them all. Here we did not do that, so we're going to be in pretty good shape on this turn. So if we face a bet, it's going to be the same thing where you just call with your good stuff. On the turn, I would probably start raising the 9s. So on the turn, I think you can slow play pocket jacks if you have them, pocket 8s, 9-8 suited, but I would start raising like the ace 9 and the king 9 on the turn at least, and probably the queen 9 too, because those hands are more vulnerable and they're still really strong. 10-9 I think you can still call, but that's because 10-9 actually has the straight on the turn of the river. Sorry, the 10-9 can make the straight on the river. And then with the 10-9, I also might just be value raising against myself, right? If I have 10-9 and my opponent has king 9, which will happen even though there's only one king 9 suited combo in the deck, I just lose more money by raising. So I think with 10-9 I would still call, but I would raise queen 9, king 9, ace 9, and then you can still keep slow playing a good amount of stuff. So then on the river we're actually going to be doing fine, I think, after calling the turn 2, because we can still slow play the 9-8 and the 8s, and then the river will probably put some more good hands in our range. But yeah, on the turn I would at least start raising the king 9s, queen 9s, ace 9s, and you can also you also should raise some bluffs, and you can raise like, maybe on the turn we'll raise like 7-6 suited or something like that. Something that maybe can make our opponent fold some random 10s. And then with 7-6 suited, we of course have outs. So yeah, I would start raising some of those type hands. It also could be okay to raise something like queen king. Maybe queen king is not good enough to call, but we can use it as a raise since it has a gutter, and the pair out might be good too. The worst hand I would call with on the turn is probably pocket 10s is the first thing that comes to my mind, but that might be too tight. But yeah, I think pocket 10s is probably the worst thing I would call with. Oh, we could also raise the turn with queen 10. Completely missed that. Yeah, queen 10 I think I would raise the turn with as well. Okay, cool. So if we're in the small blind and we bet the flop, I think we definitely want to pump the brakes with a lot of hands on the turn. So if we did bet like our aces or kings on the flop, I think it's time to start checking on the turn, because I don't think we're going to be able to get 3 streets of value with a hand like kings. I could be wrong, but I don't think we're going to be able to. And I think I would rather give my opponent an opportunity to bluff by checking, and I really don't want to face a raise. Like, it just sucks so badly when you bet kings and get raised on this turn. So I think I would start checking a lot of hands, and my betting range on the turn would be pretty polarized. I'd probably still bet like queens because queens are a little bit more vulnerable. So everything can get to be pretty mixed. So I know that's not very helpful, but like on this turn, if I had to guess, we shouldn't in theory bet all of our aces, kings, and queens, but we also shouldn't bet none of them. It's probably a mixed strategy, and those are very hard to talk about or know what to do. If I had to pick one to bet with, I would probably bet with the queens because I think they're a little bit more vulnerable. I mean the 10 does give us the straight, so I would probably be a little more likely to bet with queens, I think, to try to make random kings or aces fold, whereas kings, I guess, still have the same problem that a 10 and a queen are bad, whereas aces are a little bit less vulnerable. So, maybe we should bet on the turn with our queens and kings and check the aces. I don't know exactly, but it's probably some mixed strategy with those hands. I would keep mostly betting the nines, but you can, again, you can check raise some. And then I would probably just barrel all the queen 10s because those hands are both really strong and, there's a lot of river cards we don't want to see. So those I would definitely bet. Then I would obviously barrel the draws and king jack and ace jack. I don't know if we would have bet all of our ace jack or any of our ace jack on the flop, to be honest. If we did bet king jack, like maybe we bet some king jack suited, I probably would check call it on the turn. But it's pretty similar to like, well, I guess it's a little bit weaker than like our pocket queens because our opponent could have the 3 to the flush ace jack that called the flop. But yeah, like king jack, I would check it on the turn. But I don't think we would have c-bet the flop with a lot of our ace jack off and king jack off. I think those would have mostly check folded, so they're probably not in our range on the turn. But queen jack, I would definitely check. And then jack 10, I would definitely check as well. So yeah, check jack 10, check queen jack, bet most of the nines, bet all the queen 10s, and then probably bet more often than check the overpairs, but I think you can check those too. And then bet the draws. Okay, so let's finally do the river. All right, so the river's a 2 of spades. So it's kind of cool that we got, I know we only did 2 boards, but it's kind of cool we got 2 boards on somewhat opposite ends of the spectrum. Like, in the first board, when we bet and our opponent called, he was going to be in a lot of trouble on a blank turn or river, as we already talked about. But here, it's just much less of a problem because it's easier to slow play on this board. So if the cutoff bet flop and turn, if the small blind bet flop and turn, and you get this 2 of spades on the river, he maybe can properly bet any 2 cards on the river because, maybe his range is a little bit better once he bet the turn and then the cutoff called and then the river card comes a blank. But to be honest, I kind of doubt it. I think the cutoff can probably defend reasonably aggressively. And if he can't defend enough to prevent the... Yeah, I don't think he would be able to... I don't think the cutoff would have a problem defending enough to prevent the small blind from being able to properly bet any 2 cards. Because I think the small blind would have been barreling on the turn pretty damn... again with the D word, wow. Pretty aggressively on a... with a 10 or with a diamonds, and I don't think all those should be able to bluff on the river. So here, it's much easier to see the opponent having like air hands on the river than it was when the board was like queen 10, 8, 7, 6 with 3 clubs. Here, it's just easier to see draws that would have bet on the turn and whiff. Okay, so because of that, I think the cutoff's going to defend pretty aggressively, and if the cutoff face is a bet, I don't think it's going to be that hard to know what to do. I think it's just going to be like, you're going to be like side calling with like some, maybe like queen jack. So off the top of my head, I think I would call ace jack or better on the river, I think for sure. I think king jack and queen jack seem kind of close. I don't really know. Again, if you wanted to work out the math to see how often you need to call to prevent the opponent from being able to properly bet any 2 cards, I think that'd be a reasonable thing to do here because the opponent should just have so much air in his range on the river. And I don't think either player's range is going to be that different in terms of strength. But I'm not doing that in this video, and that takes me a while. So yeah, my guess is just I would call on the river with like king jack or ace jack and better. And then on the river, I would muck like a lot of my turn draws that floated. Or not floated, but, called the turn and then whiffed. Yeah, so I think the river should be pretty easy to play. And then bluff jamming's tricky, because on the river, we're going to be bluffing, or we're going to be value jamming with like pocket 8s and 9-8s. But it's hard to figure out exactly like what hands make the best bluffs, because the hands that make the best bluffs have like a good removal effect, and I'm not sure exactly what that would be here. It's hard to see one hand that has a much better removal effect than the other. I would say don't block a jack if we think our opponent can be value betting ace jack, which I think is kind of reasonable. So I probably wouldn't want to have a jack, but for the most part, yeah, we would value jam our 9, 8, and 8s, and we would need a couple bluffs, but I don't think there's any hands that work that much better than other hands. Oh yeah, don't bluff the flush draw. So that's another thing you can really take from this video is You know, if we have like ace queen of diamonds, it might be the worst hand. Let's just make it ace 10 of diamonds. Ace 10 of diamonds might be like one of the weakest hands we can have in our range on the river if we're in the cutoff. So that might make you think, oh, if it's our weakest hand, like let's turn it into a bluff jam. But we're blocking 2 flush draws. So then our opponent can't be bet folding as many flush draws if we have the flush draw. So if we were going to bluff jam this river, I would not do it with a hand like ace 10 of diamonds where we're blocking both a 10 and 2 diamonds. I would think you'd be more likely to do it with a hand that, well, it might be kind of tricky if you don't bluff a jack or with the ace or with the diamonds, but you would need to find something. So yeah, the ace 10 of diamonds I think would be like the nut worst hand to bluff with. But you know, we might have like ace 10 of hearts. That might be okay to bluff with, something like that, and we'll need very, very few bluffs to balance out our few value jams here. Okay, so I think that wraps up this video. I'm actually really curious to get feedback on this video because it was a lot of talking and randomly generating stuff and talking about like the concepts that I think are the most important without me having to write everything down. But I think a video like this is going to give you much better sense of how to like reasonably approach a board like when you're realistically playing. Whereas, yeah, you might get better advice and it might be a little bit more precise if I write out every single combo. But the problem with that is you can easily find like a good strategy that's not that implementable. Whereas I've spent tons and tons of time doing that kind of stuff, and you can still sort of see what my skill level is for how well I could like actually implement that knowledge while playing. Because almost everything I did, I was just generating, like randomly generating while I was recording. So if I can make the decision while recording, I probably can make the decision while playing. Whereas if I have to sit down and write out all the combos, then yeah, I'm not going to be able to probably take the correct line while I'm actually playing. So give me your feedback for videos like this. They're fun to do, but I want to see how much you guys like them. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you learned some stuff. Good luck at the tables. Bye.